So, uh, when you think about the history of World War II, at least, the way it's usually taught to us in high school textbooks, it's defined by these very distinct, very rigid geographic boundaries.
Oh, absolutely. It's compartmentalized.
Right. You have the European theater, you have the Pacific theater, the North African campaign, and then you have North America. And North America is almost always presented as this, well, the arsenal of democracy.
Right. The factory floor.
Exactly. It's the factory floor. It's the place where the tanks were built, not where they were actually blown up. It's the place where the troops trained, not where they died.
That's the standard narrative, isn't it? It's this idea that the Atlantic Ocean was this massive, impenetrable moat that basically kept the violence at arm's length.
Right.
We tend to view the war as something we went to.
Yeah, we shipped out to it.
Exactly. We went to Juno Beach, we went to Dieppe, we went to Italy. We really don't like to think of the war coming to us.
But looking at the massive stack of sources we've pulled for this deep dive today, and I mean, we're talking our CMP case files, declassified U-boat logs, memoirs from the Royal Canadian Navy, that moat was not nearly as wide as we think it was.
Not at all.
In fact, by about 1942, that moat was completely full of sharks.
That's a really fair analogy. And we aren't just talking about the open ocean here either. We are talking about the St. Lawrence River, the Gulf. These are waters that people could literally see from their kitchen windows in Quebec and Newfoundland.
And this is what we're calling the shadow of the Dominion. Because our mission today for you, the listener, is to basically dismantle that myth of the safe home front. When you actually look at the logs of a sub like U-513 or the mission files of German agents physically landing in New Brunswick, you start to realize that Canada wasn't just a supply depot. It was an active, violently contested battle space.
It really was. And, to understand the sheer gravity of this, you have to look at the German strategic perspective at the time. To the German High Command, the St. Lawrence wasn't just a river on a map. It was a jugular vein.
Right.
It was the primary artery for getting raw materials out of the North American continent. We're talking aluminum for aircraft, iron ore for steel, grain for Britain to survive. If you could cut that artery, or frankly even just constrict it a little bit, you could strangle the entire Allied war effort in Europe without ever having to set foot in London.
So today we're going to track that constriction. We're going to look at the U-boat aces who are hunting inside the Canadian maritime border. We're going to break down the sheer, almost unbelievable comedy of errors of German spies trying to infiltrate Canadian society. And we're going to look at the countermeasures.
The really high-tech stuff.
Yeah, the brutal high-tech solutions that were developed at places like Camp X to fight back against this.
And I think what we'll find as we dig into this is that the reality of espionage in Canada was this strange, incredibly jarring mix of high-stakes terror and almost farcical incompetence. You have these moments of absolute horror and then moments that feel like a bad sketch comedy.
Exactly. We're constantly going to be asking this core question today. Why don't we have a blockbuster film about the commandos of Camp X or the submarines hiding in Canadian caverns? Because as we go through this, I think we're going to prove to you that the real history completely surpasses any script a Hollywood screenwriter could ever come up with.
It's just too strange for fiction.
It really is. So let's start with the terror. Because for the people living in the Gaspé region or out on Belle Island, this wasn't some abstract threat on the radio. It was very real.
Right, and to really understand the Battle of the St. Lawrence, you have to understand the hydrography of the river itself. This is not the open Atlantic where your standard sonar works reliably.
Oh, right, because of the mix of water.
Exactly. The St. Lawrence is an absolute nightmare for anti-submarine warfare.
Yeah.
You have massive amounts of fresh water pouring out from the continent, mixing with the dense salt water coming in from the Atlantic. And this creates what are called distinct thermal layers, or thermoclines.
Okay, stop there and explain that a bit more for us, because that seems to be the critical technical reason the U-boats were so unbelievably effective in that specific area.
Sure. So a thermocline is essentially a physical boundary between layers of water that have vastly different temperatures and densities. Now, sound waves, which is exactly what ASDIC or sonar relies on to find a target, those sound waves actually bend and refract when they hit these thermal boundaries.
Because the density changes the speed of the sound.
Precisely. So a smart U-boat commander, someone like Rolf Rubenberg in U-513, he could dive his sub beneath a cold layer of water, and that layer essentially acts like an acoustic mirror to a sonar ping coming from a Canadian destroyer on the surface. The sound just bounces right off the thermal layer and goes back up, instead of penetrating down and hitting the submarine.
That is just terrifying.
It is. A U-boat could essentially sit silently on the muddy bottom of the river, completely invisible to the escort ships directly above them, and just wait for a fat merchant target to pass by.
You're completely blind to them, but they can hear your propellers perfectly.
Exactly. They have the ultimate tactical advantage. And the geography of the river just amplifies the fear factor for the civilians. Out in the middle of the North Atlantic, if a merchant ship sinks, no one on land sees it happen. But in the St. Lawrence, the local populations were literally watching the war happen from their front porches.
We actually have accounts in our sources here of locals in the Gaspé region seeing transport ships burning on the horizon while they were sitting down having dinner.
Just try to imagine the psychological impact of that. You are sitting in your living room, perhaps you're listening to the CBC radio broadcast about the terrible war going on over in Europe, and you casually look out your window and see a massive oil tanker erupt in a fireball just a few miles off the beach.
It makes it so real.
That is the shadow of the Dominion we are talking about. It creates this overwhelming sense of helplessness. The military can't protect you, and the war is right there. And nowhere was this visceral terror more obvious than at Belle Island.
Belle Island. This is in Conception Bay, Newfoundland. Now, for the listeners, we need to keep in mind that at this specific point in history, Newfoundland is a completely separate dominion.
Right, it's not Canada yet.
No, it hasn't joined Canada yet. It's British territory, essentially.
Correct. And Belle Island was a massive strategic prize for the German Navy. It had these incredibly rich iron ore mines that were absolutely crucial for feeding the steel mills over in Sydney, Nova Scotia. And that steel was what was building the Liberty ships, the tanks, the artillery guns for the entire Allied war effort.
The raw material of the arsenal of democracy.
Exactly. The Germans were well aware of this. They knew that if they could stop those ore ships from leaving Conception Bay, they could directly slow down the production of weapons hitting the battlefield in Europe.
So enter the villains of our movie. We have the U-boats. Specifically, we're talking about U-513 and U-518.
Let's just look at the sheer audacity of this operation. In 1942, these submarines didn't just patrol the open ocean lanes, they actively entered Conception Bay.
Which is pretty enclosed.
It's a very confined body of water. It's dangerous for a sub. But U-513, commanded by that ace we mentioned, Rolf Rugeberg, struck right inside the bay on September 5, 1942.
And this wasn't just a minor skirmish. They outright sank the SS Saganaga and the SS Lord Strathcona.
The sinking of the Saganaga was particularly brutal. It went down while the crew was practically looking at the shoreline. They were anchored, literally just waiting to load their cargo of iron ore. Rugeberg fired his torpedoes, and the ship essentially disintegrated. 29 men died in an instant.
Oh, man.
It really brings home the terror of the U-boat war. It's sudden, it's incredibly loud, and it's happening right in your backyard.
And then, just a couple of months later, we're talking November 1942, U-518 shows up. Now, U-518 is going to be a recurring character in our deep dive today. It's almost like the nemesis ship of this whole story.
U-518, commanded by Friedrich Wilhelm Wussmann. He sneaks in and attacks the SS Rosecastle and the PLM-27. Now, the Rosecastle was an absolute tragedy. 28 men were lost when it went down. But there is a specific detail in the historical sources regarding the Rosecastle attack that really sticks with me, and it highlights just how close this war got.
What's that?
When U-518 fired one of its torpedoes during the chaos, it actually missed the merchant ship and hit the loading pier itself.
Wait, it hit the actual landmass?
Yes, it struck the Scotia loading pier. It completely destroyed a significant chunk of the shore infrastructure. This makes Belle Island the only location in North America to be subject to a direct kinetic attack by German forces on its soil, essentially. An explosive weapon striking the physical infrastructure.
That is incredible. I mean, you have a German submarine actively firing at a pier in North America.
Yeah,
That is cinematic gold right there.
it really is.
The visual of the Saganaga crew dying within sight of land, that's horrific, but it really sets the stakes for the narrative. It proves to the audience that the enemy was literally knocking on the front door.
It shatters the entire illusion of geographic distance. And if we want to talk about the real emotional weight of this movie we're building, we absolutely have to talk about the tragedy of the SS Caribou.
Oh, yeah. This one is heavy. This is the incident that really changed the psychological landscape for the public, I think.
It really did. This happened on October 14th, 1942. Now, the SS Caribou was not a warship. It was a civilian passenger ferry. It ran a regular route between Sydney, Nova Scotia, and Port-au-Basque, Newfoundland.
So it's carrying everyday people.
Exactly. It was carrying civilians, women, children, and a lot of military personnel who were just going home on leave to see their families.
And U-69, another German U-boat, spots this ferry out in the Cabot Strait.
And completely ruthlessly torpedoes it. The loss of life was staggering for a local community. 137 people died in the freezing water, and that included 10 children.
Awful.
But the moment that truly haunts me from the historical records, this scene that would absolutely be the emotional climax of the first act of our film, involves the naval escort ship, the HMCS Grand Mère.
Right. The Grand Mère was a Canadian minesweeper that was acting as the lone military escort for the ferry, right?
Yes. And the captain of the Grand Mère, Lieutenant James Cuthbert, was suddenly faced with a true Sophie's choice, a decision that no human being should ever have to make in their lifetime.
So set the scene. The ferry is hit. It's sinking fast. People are in the freezing North Atlantic water. It's pitch dark.
Exactly. Total chaos. People are screaming. And naval protocol, the very strict, cold rules of engagement for anti-submarine warfare, dictates that if you stop your warship to pick up survivors while an enemy submarine is still actively present in the area, you become a sitting duck.
Because you're stationary.
You lose all your maneuverability. You present a massive stationary target. The logic is that you will simply be torpedoed next, your crew will die, and then there will be literally no one left to rescue anyone anyway.
So his explicit orders are to hunt the sub.
His orders are to hunt the sub. He has to deliberately ignore the screams of the drowning passengers in the dark. He has to sail past women and children freezing to death in the water and actively pursue U-69.
That is just chilling.
Yeah.
It's a literal trolley problem played out in real life in the North Atlantic.
He did it. Cuthbert hunted for that submarine for 90 excruciating minutes. Just try to imagine being on the bridge of that ship. 90 minutes of maneuvering in the dark, straining to listen to the sonar pings, dropping explosive depth charges, all while knowing with absolute certainty that just a mile behind you, hundreds of innocent people are freezing to death because you aren't there to pull them out.
The sources we have quote him later in life reflecting on that exact trauma. The sheer horror of knowing you're dropping high explosives into the water and you're the very people you are supposed to be protecting, all because the brutal math of war says you have to kill the predator first.
It's a haunting detail of naval warfare that so often gets completely glossed over in the heroic narratives. It perfectly encapsulates the sheer brutality of the Battle of the St. Lawrence. This wasn't some glorious game, it was a moral meat grinder. Now, Cuthbert did eventually turn the Grand Mère back after losing the sonar contact and managed to rescue over 100 survivors, but the psychological toll on him and his crew must have been absolutely immense.
And meanwhile, while all this horror is happening just offshore, on land, you have this really weird, almost contradictory social dynamic happening in Finland. We touched on it briefly, but tell me about the friendly invasion.
Right. Because Newfoundland is such a vital strategic location, you suddenly have tens of thousands of American and Canadian troops pouring into these small, isolated fishing communities. It created a fascinating cultural juxtaposition. On one hand, you have this massive booming employment. Locals who had struggled through the Great Depression are suddenly making great money building massive military bases like Argentia and Goose Bay.
So there's cash flowing.
Tons of money flowing in. There's jazz music, there's dances, there's new cultures clashing in a very lively way.
It's that profound tension. The wild party on a Saturday night and the solemn funeral for drowned sailors on Sunday morning.
Exactly. That is the true atmosphere of our setting. Paranoia, unexpected prosperity, and a very close proximity to violent death.
Yeah.
You have young American GIs dancing with local girls in the halls in St. John's, and literally 20 miles offshore, a German U-boat is sitting on the surface under the moonlight, charging its batteries.
Okay, so we have the atmosphere established. We have the kinetic war, the explosions, the tragedy. Now our story needs the plot twist, the element that makes the audience sit back and go, no way, that's too sci-fi, they made that up.
Oh, you mean Weather Station Kurt?
Weather Station Kurt.
Wow.
This story is my absolute favorite from the research. If you put this in a movie, the critics would pan it and say it's completely unrealistic.
Yeah.
But we have the archival photos. We have the declassified documents. It happened.
It really does strain credulity, but it is 100% historical fact.
So set the scene for us. We're moving forward a bit. It's October 1943. Why on earth did the Germans desperately need to put a weather station in the middle of nowhere in Labrador?
People generally overlook weather as a critical military asset. But in the Northern Hemisphere, Weather systems predominantly move from west to east. They form over the North American continent, sweep across the Atlantic Ocean, and hit Europe.
So basically, if you know what the barometric pressure and the weather is like in Canada today, you have a very good idea of what the weather will be like over France or Germany in 2 or 3 days.
Exactly. And if you are a general planning a massive bombing raid on London, or if you are planning a massive ground assault like the Ardennes offensive, what we call the Battle of the Bulge, you desperately need accurate, advanced meteorological data.
To know if you'll have cloud cover.
Right. But by 1943, the Allies had a complete monopoly on that information. They physically controlled the North American landmass and the Atlantic sea lanes. Germany was effectively flying blind when it came to weather forecasting.
Because their dedicated weather ships out in the ocean were getting hunted down and sunk.
Yes. And every single time a U-boat surfaced to take weather readings and radio a report back to base, it risked being triangulated by Allied high-frequency direction finding, what they called HFDUF.
HFDUF.
Yeah. The Allies would instantly pinpoint the transmission's origin and dispatch a destroyer or an aircraft to kill the submarine. So the German Navy approached the engineering firm Siemens with a very specific problem. We need an automated weather station that is completely autonomous, robust enough to survive the brutal Arctic winter, and silent enough to avoid radar detection.
So they essentially asked them to build a robot.
Essentially, yes. It's called the WFL-26, or the Wetterfunkerratland, and it looks exactly like something out of a 1950s sci-fi comic book. It consists of 10 massive cylindrical canisters, each about a meter high and weighing over 200 pounds. One canister contains the actual instruments, anemometers, thermometers, barometers, and a 10-meter-tall extendable antenna.
And the rest of the canisters.
The rest are packed with heavy-duty nickel-cadmium batteries.
NiCads. That actually sounds pretty advanced for 1943 technology.
It was absolute cutting edge. Standard lead-acid batteries of the era would instantly freeze and crack open in the ambient temperatures of the Labrador tundra. These NiCads were specifically engineered to hold a stable charge in severe sub-zero conditions for months.
And the daring mission is to somehow secretly plant this massive piece of tech on North American soil.
Yes. It is the only known armed German military operation to actually take place on North American land during the entire war, specifically designed to install this technology. They load the entire disassembled station onto a submarine, U-537, commanded by Peter Shrew, and they sail all the way across the Atlantic to northern Labrador to a desolate inlet called Martin Bay.
Now, for listeners who don't know, this is incredibly desolate, rugged country.
It is the deep tundra. It's jagged rocks, sheer ice, and polar bears. That's about it. They arrive in late October. The crew has to physically lug these 220-pound canisters up a steep, rocky hill in freezing conditions, and they actually have armed sailors posted as lookouts on Canadian soil, well, Newfoundland soil at the time, actively watching the horizon for Allied patrols, while their scientists frantically assemble this device.
But here is a part of the story that just completely gets me. The deception aspect. The Germans knew that eventually someone might stumble across it, maybe an Inuit hunter, maybe a local trapper, or a lost military patrol. So they carefully camouflaged it.
They did. They painted the entire apparatus in a disruptive pattern of white and black to blend in perfectly with the snow and the exposed rock. But the absolute best movie prop detail of this whole operation is what the crew intentionally scattered around the site before they left.
Anti-American cigarette packs.
Exactly. To make it look like an Allied military installation. The logic being, if a local trapper finds an abandoned campsite littered with empty packs of Lucky Strikes, they are just going to assume it was a sloppy American weather patrol and ignore it.
That is so clever.
But the absolute pied de resistance of this deception, they painted a very specific name on the side of one of the main canisters.
Yeah, they stenciled on Canadian Meteor Service.
Which sounds very official, very boring, very bureaucratic.
Except
for two major problems. One, that specific agency simply didn't exist. It was a complete fabrication by German intelligence. And two, as we mentioned earlier, Labrador wasn't part of Canada yet. It was still a British dominion. So it would be exactly like someone stumbling across a satellite dish marked Mexican Space Agency sitting in a field in downtown Dallas.
Right.
It doesn't make any political or jurisdictional sense, but the Germans bet heavily on the fact that a casual observer wouldn't know the intricate nuances of local federal bureaucracy.
And the crazy thing is, it worked. Or, well, at least the disguise worked perfectly.
The weather station itself, not so much. It worked for a few days, maybe a few weeks at most. It sent its encrypted data bursts back to Germany, Then it just went completely silent. Likely the batteries finally froze despite the advanced design, or perhaps the radio frequency was jammed. But you're right, the physical disguise was flawless.
Because literally nobody found it.
Nobody found it during the entire war. In fact, it sat there slowly rusting in the harsh Arctic wind, completely undisturbed for decades.
This is the crazy twist for me.
Yeah.
It wasn't found until 1977.
1977, a geomorphologist named Peter Johnson was out in Martin Bay doing some field research. He literally stumbled upon this massive array of metal cylinders. He saw the stencil-marked Canadian Meteor Service, reasonably assumed it was just some old, forgotten Canadian military junk, maybe left over from the Cold War WW line, made a quick note of it in his journal, and just walked away.
He had absolutely no idea he was looking at an armed Nazi relic.
None at all. It actually took a retired engineer from Siemens, the very company that originally built the device back in Germany, a guy named Franz Selinger, to finally figure it out in the late 1980s.
How did he figure it out?
He was writing a comprehensive history book about German meteorology, and he was digging through the surviving wartime paperwork for U-537. He saw the coordinates and realized, wait a minute, we left a massive weather station in Labrador and never went back for it.
So the Canadian government had to go back up to the Arctic and retrieve it.
They did. An expedition went up, verified what it was, and brought it back. And you can actually see it today. It's sitting in the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. But just picture that visual for a moment. A Nazi robot weather station sitting completely alone in the Canadian Arctic for over 30 years with nobody in the entire world knowing it was there. It really speaks to the sheer vastness of the Canadian landscape. It is the perfect hiding place.
That is absolutely the technological sleeper cell segment of our historical movie. But now we need to pivot. Because we've talked a lot about the machines, the submarines, the weather stations. Now we need to talk about the men. Because German intelligence didn't just send silent robots across the Atlantic, they sent living spies.
And this is where the entire tone of our story shifts violently from a tense techno-thriller to an absolute farce.
We need a villain for the plot, or at least someone who is really trying their hardest to be a villain.
And for that, we return to our nemesis submarine, U-518.
U-518 is back. It's November 9, 1942. This is literally just a week after it was sinking those ore ships at Belle Island.
It navigates into the Baie de Chaleur and surfaces off the coast of New Carlisle, Quebec. Now, this is a very quiet, very close-knit rural community.
And out of the hatch comes a rubber dinghy. And sitting in it is Werner von Janowski.
Known to German intelligence by his codename, Agent Bobby.
Agent Bobby. Okay. He's dressed in civilian clothes, or at least what he firmly believes passes for standard Canadian civilian clothes. He's carrying a suitcase. What exactly is his grand mission?
His mission on paper is incredibly ambitious. He is supposed to travel undetected from the coast to Montreal, make contact with the leader of the Canadian fascist movement, a man named Adrien Arcand, and actively incite a campaign of sabotage and armed revolt. He essentially wants to start a massive fifth-column movement right in the heart of Quebec.
There's just one massive, glaring problem with that master plan.
Adrien Arcand was already locked up in jail. He had been safely interned by the Canadian government since the very start of the war.
So German high command intelligence was slightly out of date.
Woefully out of date. It strongly suggests that the Abwehr had absolutely no real espionage network on the ground in Canada. They were effectively just throwing darts at a board, guessing at what Canadian political life was actually like. They were sending Janowski on a complete fool's errand from day one, but the sheer comedy of errors that follows him is exactly why this character wouldn't survive the first 10 minutes of a James Bond movie.
Let's walk through his infiltration step by step, because it's amazing. He lands on the beach in the dark, he buries his naval uniform in the sand, and he confidently walks into the local New Carlisle hotel.
He wants to rent a room, take a hot bath, and get some breakfast, which is a completely reasonable request after spending weeks in a cramped, freezing submarine. But he makes mistake after glaring mistake. It's practically a masterclass in how not to be a secret agent.
Okay, let's list them. Mistake number one.
The money. He tries to pay the hotel clerk with Canadian bills that were completely obsolete. There were these large, old denomination bills from a past series that the bank had long since withdrawn from circulation.
So he's confidently handing over cash that looks totally fake or weird to a local.
Exactly. It would be exactly like someone walking into a cafe today and trying to pay for a coffee with an old, discontinued paper $2 bill in Canada. It instantly draws attention to you and marks you clearly as an outsider who doesn't know how things work.
All right, mistake number two.
The matches. While he's waiting, he casually lights a cigarette using a box of Belgian matches.
Why is that a specific problem?
Because in 1942 Canada, absolutely everything was heavily taxed by the government to help pay for the war effort: cigarettes, alcohol, and matches. If you possessed a box of matches that did not have the official Canadian excise tax stamp glued to it, it meant you were carrying smuggled contraband. It seems like a tiny detail, but for the hotel owner's very observant son, Earl Annett Jr., it was a massive red flag.
A dead giveaway. Okay, mistake number 3.
The smell. Janowski smelled very distinctly and very strongly of raw diesel fumes.
Which, if you've just spent a month sealed inside a U-boat, makes total sense.
U-boats were absolutely notorious for their stench. It was this foul mix of diesel fuel, unwashed sweat, mold, and recycled air. You simply cannot wash that kind of smell out of a heavy wool suit in 20 minutes. He smelled like a walking oil refinery. In a quiet, rural Quebec hotel lobby, a guy smelling like a submarine really stands out.
And then we get to mistake number 4. His cover story. When they ask how he got there, he casually claimed he had just arrived in town by taking the morning bus.
And Earl Annett Jr. knew for a fact that the local bus hadn't even run that day.
So he's batting 0 for 4 before he's even had his eggs.
Exactly. And the real hero of this segment isn't some highly trained Canadian super spy. It's just Earl Annett Jr. He's just a regular civilian guy, a local hotel worker, but he spots every single one of these inconsistencies. He realizes something is very, very wrong with this stranger. And this ties perfectly back to that atmosphere of paranoia we talked about in segment 1. The locals were vigilant. They were watching.
So Janowski eventually leaves the hotel, completely oblivious, and heads down to the local train station to catch a ride to Montreal.
And Annett secretly follows him. He alerts a local provincial police constable, a man named Alphonse Duchesneau.
I love the confrontation scene that happens next. Duchesneau intercepts Janowski as he's sitting comfortably on the train car.
Right, Janowski tries to play it cool. He tries to bluff his way out. He claims he's just a traveling radio salesman from Toronto. But Duchesneau isn't buying it and demands to physically search his luggage.
And this is the big reveal of the scene.
Janowski just drops the act completely. He sees he's cornered by a local cop on a train. He puffs out his chest, says, and I quote the police report directly here, "Searching my luggage won't be necessary. I am a German officer who serves his country as you serve yours."
Very dramatic, very theatrical.
Oh, very. And the actual inventory of that suitcase, when they finally open it, is a spy thriller prop master's absolute dream.
What's in it?
A fully loaded automatic pistol, heavy brass knuckles, $6,000 in untraceable cash, and a highly powerful, compact radio transmitter.
So they catch him red-handed. He lasted less than 24 hours on Canadian soil.
A complete and total failure of a mission. But the story actually doesn't end there. The RCMP quickly steps in and takes custody of him from the local police. And they decide to launch something called Operation Watt CHDE.
Oh, they want to turn him into a double agent.
Exactly. They want to use his captured radio transmitter to feed carefully crafted disinformation straight back to German intelligence. They want to make him a double agent, basically trying to mimic the massive success of the double-cross system that MI5 was running so brilliantly over in England.
Does it work for them?
Well, the historical sources are quite critical of the Canadian effort here. The files describe the RCMP at this point as being relative amateurs compared to the seasoned veterans of MI5 in Britain. They simply hadn't run a complex counterintelligence op like this before.
Right. It takes experience to do it right.
Janowski officially cooperates with them, but the strong suspicion among historians is that he actually managed to secretly tip off his German handlers that he had been compromised. A classic triple cross.
How would he do that if they were watching him broadcast?
We suspect Janowski deliberately slipped in a prearranged security check. Most agents had a subtle, agreed-upon signal with their handlers, something like, if I am transmitting safely, I will end every single sentence with a period. If I have a gun to my head and I am captured, I will deliberately leave the final period off. The RCMP operators likely missed a very subtle rhythmic change in his Morse code tapping, or maybe a missing code word. Whatever it was, the line just went completely dead. Germany realized Agent Dobby was burned, and they never sent another agent to that specific location.
So eventually the RCMP just gives up and ships him off to England.
Yeah, they sent him to Camp 020, which was the famous British interrogation center. He basically spends the rest of the war sitting in a cell there. So, Agent Bobby, great entrance off the submarine, terrible execution on the ground.
But he wasn't the only one who landed. And this naturally brings us to segment 4, the reluctant spy. If Janowski is our failed, incompetent villain, then Alfred Langbein is I don't know, the anti-hero of the story.
I think he's the character the audience actually roots for because his motivations are so incredibly human. He represents the everyman who just gets caught up in the massive war machine.
Tell us about Langbein's journey.
He landed a bit earlier than Janowski, in May of 1942. He was dropped off near St. Martin's, New Brunswick by U-213.
Same basic setup. Rubber dinghy, civilian suit, suitcase full of cash, radio.
Exactly the same kit. But Langbein does something entirely different the moment his boots hit the beach. He gets to shore, and he immediately digs a hole and buries his uniform and his radio transmitter deep in the sand. He doesn't go check into a local hotel and try to buy things with weird money to draw attention to himself. He quietly makes his way to Montreal and then eventually settles in Ottawa.
And he starts spying on the capital.
No, he just starts living. He uses the substantial Nazi operational funds he was given to just live quietly as a regular citizen. He rents a modest room. He goes out to the local movie theaters. He eats his meals at regular diners. He literally lives right in the capital city of the enemy nation for 2 whole years.
He just completely ghosted the Abwehr.
Completely. He never once went back for his radio. He never turned it on. He was the spy who just decided to quit on day one.
That is hilarious to me. He's just out there enjoying a peaceful Canadian life on Adolf Hitler's dime.
It really creates a fascinating psychological portrait of the man. He obviously didn't believe in the Nazi cause or the mission at all, or perhaps he was just observant enough to see that the war was already ultimately lost for Germany.
Yeah.
He just wanted to survive the conflict quietly.
Right up until the money ran out.
Yeah. The classic everyday problem. You can't exactly wire your bosses in Berlin for a top-up when you're a sleeper agent who hasn't bothered to report in for 2 years.
So it's 1944 and he's completely broke. What does a German spy do in Ottawa when he can't pay rent?
He casually walks into a Canadian Naval Intelligence office in downtown Ottawa and turns himself in.
He just walks in and says, "Hi, I'm a German spy. I'm out of cash. Please arrest me."
Basically, yes. The RCMP interrogators simply couldn't believe his story at first. They kept grilling him, asking, "What infrastructure did you sabotage? Who are your secret contacts in the government?" And he just kept telling them, "Nobody. I didn't do anything. I just wanted to get away from the Nazis."
That is just a fantastic character arc for a movie. The man who cynically used the terrifying machinery of war just to escape the regime.
It creates such a great thematic contrast with Janowski. Janowski was a rigid, true believer who was utterly incompetent at his job. Langbein, on the other hand, was clearly competent enough to hide in plain sight for 2 entire years, but he had absolutely no desire to be a villain.
But then, in our sources, there's a third figure that pops up. A real mystery, the urban legend. And this really fits perfectly into the whole folklore aspect of the Shadow of the Dominion that we're talking about.
Yes. This incredible story comes from the published memoirs of Jacques Castonguay. It takes place in Saint-Jean-Port-Joli, which is this incredibly beautiful, quaint village right on the shore of the St. Lawrence River.
The story of the luxury beggar.
Right. The local residents started reporting seeing a strange man walking around. A man with very, very refined manners, clearly highly educated, who would politely knock on farmhouse doors, begging for scraps of food. But here's the kicker of the story. He absolutely refused to speak a single word to anyone.
Not a word of English, not a word of French.
Nothing, just polite hand gestures. But the locals noted that when they gave him a bowl of soup, he ate it with the pristine etiquette of a European aristocrat. He held his cutlery perfectly, he was bowing, he was polite, but utterly silent.
And what was the prevailing theory about who this guy was?
The intense local theory, and this was Castonguay's firm belief as well, was that he was a highly trained German military officer actively scouting the coastal area, or perhaps he was a landed agent whose local contact had simply never showed up to meet him. And the theory was that he couldn't speak to the locals because his thick German accent would give him away instantly. If he opened his mouth, he's caught. So he ingeniously plays the role of the mute beggar.
That is incredibly creepy. Just imagining a silent man in a dusty suit, sitting at your kitchen table eating your soup, who might actually be a ruthless U-boat commander.
It perfectly highlights the wartime folklore of the era. Whether that specific man was actually a Nazi spy, or just a deeply traumatized European refugee, or even just a local drifter with good table manners is almost beside the point. The fact that everyone believed he was a spy shows just how deep the coastal paranoia ran. The very real presence of the U-boats just offshore created this tense psychological landscape where every single stranger you met was a potential commando. It completely turns the cozy, innocent village life into a tense thriller setting.
So we have the brutal U-boat attacks, we have the hidden Nazi technology in the Arctic, the bad spy who gets caught, the reluctant spy who gives up, and the creepy mystery man. But any good spy thriller needs the good guys. It needs that cool headquarters where the geniuses are working around the clock fighting back.
And Canada absolutely had that. In fact, Canada was the primary hub for North American intelligence training during the war. We have to talk about Camp X.
Segment 5. The Heroes and the Hub. Camp X is just legendary in intelligence circles.
It was located right on the shores of Lake Ontario near Whitby. Officially, on paper, it was just called a special training school. But in reality, it was the ultimate finishing school for secret agents before they dropped behind enemy lines.
And it was run by a Canadian man named Sir William Stevenson.
Code name, Intrepid.
I mean, a name like Intrepid sounds like it completely belongs in a comic book.
Stevenson is one of those larger-than-life historical figures. He was a decorated World War I fighter ace. He became a self-made millionaire businessman between the wars, and he was the specific man that Winston Churchill personally sent to New York to coordinate British intelligence operations in the Americas. He set up Camp X in Canada because the United States wasn't officially in the war yet, and the Allies desperately needed a secure, clandestine place to train American and Canadian agents.
And the connection to popular fiction here is very, very direct.
You're talking about Ian Fleming, the author of the famous James Bond novels.
He actually knew Stevenson.
They were close friends and colleagues. Fleming spent considerable time in Toronto and actively visited Camp X during the war. It is heavily implied by historians and pretty widely accepted that William Stevenson was a primary direct inspiration for the James Bond character. That whole license to kill persona, the reliance on cool gadgets, the incredible sophistication that's basically intrepid.
So James Bond is basically a Canadian guy.
Well, spiritually speaking, perhaps. But Camp X wasn't just a gentleman's club for show. The training was brutal. They rigorously taught unarmed, silent killing, quite literally, the physical art of eliminating an enemy sentry without making a single sound. They taught advanced explosive demolition, document forgery, and absolutely crucial to our earlier point about the weather stations, they taught advanced radio operation.
Tell me a bit about Hydra.
Hydra was the massive, cutting-edge radio transmitter array built right at Camp X. It was arguably the technological neurological center of the entire Allied intelligence network. It securely connected Washington, London, and Ottawa. It was powerful enough to bounce signals all the way to agents deep in Europe and South America. So while the recruits were outside learning how to strangle people in the freezing mud, the radio operators inside were quietly routing the most sensitive, top-secret messages of the war through a farm in Whitby, Ontario.
It's a huge legacy to leave behind. You could argue the modern CIA's DNA is partly Canadian.
Absolutely, you could. The OSS, which was the direct American precursor to the CIA, explicitly sent their very first batches of agents up to Camp X to learn the tradecraft of how to be spies from the Canadians and the British.
But there was another intelligence hub located right in Ottawa that was just as vitally important as Camp X, but it gets almost zero glory in the history books. The Examination Unit.
The X Unit. It sounds cool, doesn't it?
It does. It sounds exactly like the X-Files.
Yeah.
It was Canada's top secret cryptographic bureau, the Code Breakers. Everyone always talks about Bletchley Park in the UK and Alan Turing. Well, the Examination Unit was the Canadian equivalent of that, and they had a very specific geopolitical specialty.
Vichy France.
Right, because Canada had a very weird, very complicated diplomatic situation going on with France at the time.
This gets incredibly complex. After the nation of France fell to the invading Nazis early in the war, the new Vichy regime actively collaborated with Hitler. Britain immediately cut all diplomatic ties with them. But Canada, primarily because of the deep cultural ties of Quebec and the very delicate politics of French Canada, deliberately maintained full diplomatic relations with Vichy France far longer than any of the other allies did. Prime Minister Mackenzie King simply didn't want to alienate his crucial Quebec voting base.
Which, obviously, a lot of people were very angry about. It looked an awful lot like appeasement to a fascist puppet state.
Yes, it was highly controversial at the time, but looking back at it purely from an espionage perspective, it was an absolute intelligence goldmine. Because Canada recognized Vichy, it meant there were high-level Vichy French diplomats actively working in embassies in Ottawa. And the examination unit could quietly intercept all their encrypted telegraph traffic.
And they broke the codes.
They cracked them wide open, and because they did, they scored a massive strategic victory that became known as the Martinique scenario.
This really feels like the climax of the intellectual code-breaking side of our movie.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
There was a massive paralyzing fear among the Allies that the powerful French naval fleet stationed in the Caribbean, specifically anchored at Martinique, would be officially handed over to the Nazis by the Vichy government. There were heavy aircraft carriers and fast cruisers sitting right there.
Which would have been a complete disaster for the Battle of the Atlantic if those heavy French warships suddenly joined the German wolf packs hunting the convoys.
It would have been catastrophic. We might have lost the Atlantic. But the examination unit in Ottawa managed to intercept and decode a direct top-secret order sent from Pierre Laval, who was the Vichy prime minister, directly to Admiral Robert, the fleet commander in the Caribbean. And the order was to immediately scuttle the entire fleet, to deliberately sink the ships in the harbor so the approaching Americans couldn't capture them.
And because they intercepted it in time.
Because they had the intercept, they could alert Washington and London immediately. The Americans and the British could quickly put massive diplomatic and military pressure on Admiral Robert. They literally knew his secret orders before he even officially acknowledged receiving them. Because of that, the fleet wasn't scuttled, it wasn't handed over to the Nazis, it was safely neutralized. That one massive intelligence success originating from a bunch of codebreakers sitting in a nondescript civilian building in Ottawa had a global immediate impact on the outcome of the war at sea.
That is the intellectual battlefield right there. So you have this incredible physical danger happening out in St. Lawrence River, and simultaneously, you have this high-stakes mental chess match happening in Ottawa.
And you also have the St. Pierre and Miquelon incident, which perfectly ties all of these elements together.
Oh, right, the small islands off the coast of Newfoundland?
Yes, these are technically sovereign French territory. They were firmly under the control of the Vichy regime, and there was a very powerful, very active radio station located on the islands. The Allies were deeply afraid that this station was actively guiding German U-boats directly into the paths of the vulnerable Allied supply convoys leaving Halifax.
Literally guiding the wolves right to the sheep.
Exactly. So the Free French Forces, General de Gaulle's loyal navy, actually sailed over and seized the islands in a sudden armed surprise raid. It caused a massive, screaming diplomatic headache between the governments of Canada, the U.S., and Britain, but it successfully removed that radio threat. It just shows, yet again, that the actual kinetic war was happening right here in our waters. It wasn't just over there in Europe.
So let's synthesize all this. We are basically at the outro of our movie now. We have massive U-boats firing torpedoes at mining towns. We have robot weather stations hidden in the snow. We have bumbling spies with bad cover stories. We have a literal super spy school. Why isn't this a massive movie? Why isn't this a central pillar to our memory of the war?
I really think it simply comes down to the comfortable narrative we've chosen to tell ourselves over the decades. We much prefer the narrative of the Grand Crusade. We bravely went over to Europe to liberate it. That is a heroic, proactive, triumphant story. But the story of the Battle of the St. Lawrence, the story of the spies, that is a story of deep vulnerability. It's a terrifying story, being attacked right in our own home while we slept.
It feels incredibly invasive. It totally disrupts our modern sense of continental security.
Exactly. But the historical story is simply undeniable when you look at the primary sources. Canada was absolutely not a safe haven. It was a very active theater of war, a shadow theater, maybe, a secret war, but it was incredibly active and deadly.
And the contrast between the different elements is what makes it so incredibly cinematic. You have the utterly amateurish nature of someone like Janowski with his bad matches and his diesel smell, constantly juxtaposed against the hyper-sophistication of Camp X and the brilliant codebreakers of the examination unit. It's practically a slapstick comedy of errors on one side and a deadly, high-stakes political thriller on the other.
It creates a really fascinating historical texture. It's not just one uniform tone, it's deep tragedy with the sinking of the Caribou. It's total farce with Janowski getting caught on a train. It's creepy mystery with Weather Station Kurt and the Silent Beggar. It's high-tech espionage with the X Unit.
And speaking of that mystery, I want to leave you, the listener, with the final, really provocative thought to mull over. We only know all the specific details about Janowski because he was incredibly incompetent and got caught immediately. We only know the full story of Langbein because he ran out of cash and voluntarily gave up.
This is the exact question that keeps intelligence historians up late at night. The captured German naval records strongly suggest that other agents were successfully landed by U-boats on the Canadian coast. The declassified RCMP files even casually mention the hunt for an unknown Italian agent. There were numerous phantom sightings in the remote Gaspé region that were simply never explained.
So who were they?
Right. Did any of them actually succeed? Did a Langbain-type figure land on a dark beach, quietly bury his uniform, move to Vancouver or Toronto, and simply never run out of his operating money? Did they just seamlessly blend in, live out their entire lives as regular, hard-working Canadians, and eventually take their wartime secrets right to the grave?
That is a genuinely chilling thought. Just the idea that the nice, quiet old man who lived down your street in 1955 might have originally arrived in North America in a rubber dinghy launched from a Nazi submarine.
It is entirely statistically possible because, as we've seen today, in the vast shadow of the Dominion, it's very, very easy to simply disappear.
Well, on that note, the next time you're standing on the beautiful shore of the St. Lawrence River or looking out at the cold Atlantic from a cliff in Newfoundland, just take a moment to remember. The horizon wasn't always empty.
It certainly wasn't.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll see you next time.